I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. We're back here in Dubai at the Global Education and Skills Forum, the sort of Davos of global education. Lots of action happening. One of the key players is with me right now, David Archer, who is the Head of Public Services at ActionAid. You were Head of Education there. You still look at the education portfolio.
Education is the number one priority for me.
So let's talk a little bit global education especially. I know you're involved with the GP, the Global Partnership for Education, as a board member in the past and now still on the finance committee there.
Yeah.
GP has just gone through their replenishment round. It was a bit disappointing, right? The total numbers that came in were lower than what we're hoped for.
Depends which way you look at it.
Okay, let's talk about that. How do you see them?
So 2.1 billion roughly from the donors against the target 3.1 billion, sort of disappointing on that front. But what was actually genuinely exciting, and I think tells the big story of GPE, is the $30 billion that were placed by developing countries to their own citizens, using the GP replenishment as the moment to make those commitments.
And just to be clear, that's basically saying you have to spend at least 20% of your budget on education.
So national governments, to qualify for GPE funding, have to maintain or increase their spending towards 20% or above.
Okay.
Now, based on very seriously measured benchmarks on existing spending and what were the commitments to increase spending, developing country ministers made commitments to increase their spending by $30 billion.
That's amazing.
And that tells us the fundamental truth about financing of education, which is, as the Education Commission declared, 97% of the funding which is needed for education is going to come from domestic sources.
Sure.
GPE, as a mechanism, has managed to sort of figure out how to use relatively modest donor funding, $2 billion, relatively
pretty modest, yeah,
to leverage and to enhance the domestic financing commitments. That's a good step. However, as you yourself say, they are only really looking at the share of the budget spent on education. And one of our big points in discussions with GPE is that it's important, but it's a fairly blunt instrument. And actually much bigger attention needs to be paid to the size of the domestic tax base. Because if you get 20% share of a small pie, it's a small amount.
It's a small amount.
So what you really want to do is to encourage governments to expand the overall tax base of the country, and then education is one of the biggest beneficiaries of that expansion. So that's an ongoing discussion we're having with GPE, but there is no doubt that GPE has made progress in making better progress towards ensuring that the funds that it commits lead to increased domestic financing rather than reductions, as we have seen in some other global funds, some other aid.
The money is fungible
sectors,
and somebody moves.
Yeah, so governments, it all actually came back to, I think it was a grant in 2012 from GPE to Uganda. The Ugandan government came and asked for $100 million from GPE, but they had cut their own domestic spending from 17% of the budget to 14% of the budget. And I was on the GP board at the time and said, this is outrageous. How can you reward a government for cutting its own spending, which is effectively what you're doing? And it was at that point that we made the policy commitment in GPE that you have to maintain your own spending in order to qualify.
Now that can make good sense in the case of Uganda, but what do you do in countries where there's conflict, where the opportunity to really broaden the tax base or raise real revenue domestically is not there yet? There are many children who are not in schools, or schools are low quality. Is GPE the instrument for that, or is that just not the case where GPE ought to play?
60% of the countries which GPE funds are fragile or conflict-affected countries. And so yes, they do. GPE does play a hugely important role in many of the countries which are affected by emergencies or affected by conflict. There are some challenges in some cases which would exceed what GPE is well set up to do. And so we see the emergence of education cannot wait as a funding mechanism to rapidly respond to situations of emergencies. My personal view is I have a problem with the idea that you have a harmonised fund on education, which is GPE, where all of the bilateral donors, multilateral donors working together, and then you set up a separate harmonised fund for their education. I'd much rather they were working together and that ECW, Education Cannot Wait, was hosted by the Global Partnership for Education. That might still happen in the coming years. But it is, because in education we are sort of blessed in not having a problem which many other sectors suffer from, which is when you have a lot of humanitarian funding going into a particular sector, you have wonderful emergency response, and then you have a real challenge of continuity and moving from the emergency response into the longer term system strengthening. In education, we haven't had that because there's been so little humanitarian funding for education.
Funding is just so low.
It's a bad
right.
So, but since we know that this is a problem in other sectors, we have to avoid that in the education sector, and that means making sure that when we do have an emergency funding mechanism, it works in a very, very close way with the longer term system strengthening and longer term development of the system. And I think we're making progress towards that, but we need to make sure that we don't end up with GPE with one model, ECW with another, and then too much competition.
You know, you've been working in this space a long time, and some people talk about this idea that there's going to be a moment for global education that's like global health, a paradigm shift. There will be more funding, whether it's private or government. Do you see that in the horizon, or is that a mirage?
I like to tell a positive story, and I think that we have a more positive story to tell in education than we do in health. Because if you look at the GP replenishment last month, you add the $2 billion pledged by donors and the $30 billion of long-term sustainable funding committed by developing countries, that's $32 billion. That's larger than any of the global fund replenishments.
Sure.
I think a lot of the global health funding has had a real problem of mobilizing lots of short-term funding and lots of focused funding for particular diseases, but has a real struggle with system strengthening and longer-term reform.
Which is one of the reasons the creation of the GFF, for example.
So I think education has a good story to tell of having grappled with the question of how do you focus on system strengthening, which is absolutely the focus of the GPE, and how do you leverage the longer-term developing country government commitments and make sure that you put those things together. Of course we want more money, and we need a lot more money on the table, but I think let's not ignore the progress that has been made and the strengths that we have in education compared to health.
Let me ask the how much question, and here's my reason. This might get very technical in the weeds, but I'm thinking about the World Development Report this year, which talks about the learning crisis, and I believe it says there's a $39 billion gap in funding for global education. Now, if we just got 30 billion mobilized plus 2, or maybe it's $1 billion a year from GP, does that mean the gap has now shrunk down to 8?
They talk about the 39 billion as the external gap. So, and there's also a gap in domestic funding. So the 30 billion from developing countries fills the gap in domestic financing. But that's so important. If 97% of the money needs to come from developing country governments, then we should be spending 97% of our efforts in helping developing countries expand their tax base and increase their spending on education. My worry is that the international discourse focuses so much on the aid agenda and doesn't do enough to look at what developing countries are doing for themselves and how they can expand that funding. And we talk about 4 S's, that developing countries need to increase 4 S's. Increase the share, the budget to education, towards or exceeding 20%. Increase the size of the government budget overall, so that's the tax base. Increase the sensitivity of the allocation of that spending, driven by an agenda of equity, so that the most marginalised and most excluded get access, and increase the scrutiny of the money to make sure it arrives in practice. Because as the World Development Report flags very clearly, the most disadvantaged areas are the ones who receive least money, and unless you're scrutinising the money in practice, it doesn't arrive. So increase the share, the size, the sensitivity of allocation, and the scrutiny of budgets, and that's an agenda for transforming domestic financing, and that's the big story of how we're going to achieve change.
It's an ambitious agenda, but a hopeful one.
Yeah, I think so. And aid does play a role, and we need more aid. We should have more aid. We would like to get to that $39 billion figure of coordinated external aid, but not at the cost of not displacing domestic financing.
It needs to be a pie that's growing.
It needs to be a part of a pie, and it needs to, and all the time we're bringing in external funding, we need to be thinking, are we in the process strengthening domestic financing, strengthening domestic systems, so that we have a long-term solution.
So before I let you go, this is an interesting forum in part because you have so many different perspectives. You've got just about every angle within the global education field represented. Is there anything you feel is missing from the conversation, coming from your perspective at ActionAid, that doesn't get talked about enough here?
I would say the link between education and tax justice. So if we are talking about so I don't see sessions on that, and I think that strategic financing of education those of us who are really concerned to make a breakthrough need to be talking about the tax justice angle. So whenever anyone asks me, what is the role for the private sector in the field of education? I say there's an absolutely critical, fundamental role for the private sector. It's pay your taxes in the countries where you make a profit,
right?
Because that's the long-term historic mechanism for ensuring that we achieve quality public services for all. So that's the first message.
Yeah.
And it is hugely important that the tax justice agenda is hugely important at a domestic level, but you do need to start looking at global reforms. We're sitting here in the year of the Paradise Papers, and some of the we see the sort of industrial scale tax avoidance, tax evasion. There needs to be global action to change the global rules and the enforcement of those rules around tax. At the moment, OECD set the rules on tax. What we really need is a democratic, inclusive UN body that's resourced and empowered to set tax rules and to enforce them effectively, and to start looking at international financial transactions taxes, taxes on deposits in tax havens. That's how you're going to achieve the sort of scale of resource increase that education will probably be the biggest single beneficiary of, and then health, and then other sectors as well. Too much of our time is spent in divisive debates where we say we want an extra % for education, and health say we need an extra percentage of this budget, or water wants this, or energy wants that.
Capture more tax and you don't have to have that
increase the base for everyone, and it's a common win. And that has to be part of the solution. I would like to see those discussions really held properly in this sort of space, because we have so many wonderful actors around the table here.
Well, these are all topics we are going to continue to pursue at Devex and to cover. We appreciate you taking some time with us and being a part of this today.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.